Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming today. As most of you, if not all of you know, my name is Ramya. I'm the Director of Environmental Science for the Key Biscayne Community Foundation. Today we have with us Dr. Larry Brand. He's a professor at the Rosenstiel School at University of Miami. He is going to talk to you guys about algae and health consequences. I think in particular how it affects the brain. He did give a presentation for us once, I think it was 2 years ago, and it was extremely interesting, the effects that different types of algae can have on the brain. And it's not just that, but how different algae you'll know whether they're affecting you or not right away, or if they take longer, and then the different consequences they have. But this one in particular, I think, is something that a lot of you are going to be very interested in. But with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Brand.
Thank you. Now, when you think of algae, most people think of little round green things, or green scum, things like that. And in fact, that's been known for 2,000 years. Virgil, 2,000 years ago, said that there's nothing so useless and vile as algae. Many people's view of this. But actually, the first time in my career is on the good side of algae. I mean, if you had no algae in the ocean, you would have no life. Low concentration of algae are very good. They're the base of the food chain. Some of them are little round green things, but a lot of them are quite beautiful, actually. But we're going to focus on the bad side of the algae now. And this is a result, basically, we're now trying to feed 8 billion people on this planet. That takes a lot of food, okay, and that takes a lot of fertilizer to fertilize those crops, okay. And plants need two major nutrients, are nitrogen and phosphorus. And they need it in about a 16-to-1 ratio. What happens when you fertilize your crops, for various reasons, a lot of times not all that nutrients goes into your crops. Some of it runs off into your local waterways and eventually down to your coastal oceans and so on. It can create your harmful algal blooms. To the extent that the nutrients do make it into your crops, humans then eat it, disappear when we eat it, it ends up in the sewage. It can also end up in your local waterways and eventually in your coastal ocean. So not surprising, just look on a global basis, most of your large harmful algal blooms around the world tend to be downstream of your major agricultural areas and your major urban areas. But there are certain cases, such as in South Florida, where that ratio gets altered, okay? So for example, if you've got a 32-to-1 ratio, plants take it up in a 16-to-1 ratio, so they use up all the phosphorus, and you've got 16 extra nitrogens, which means we call this a phosphorus-limited ecosystem. In other words, if you add more nitrogen, it can't generate any more algae because the plants have run out of phosphorus. It's a very simple concept, but it's an important one. And you'd be amazed at how many people, including like politicians and so, and environmental groups, do not understand that concept. Good example, right here in Miami, a number of our county commissioners, so they'll see what happens. Turns out Biscayne Bay is phosphorus limited for reasons I'll explain in a minute, okay? And so what they'll see is a lot of nitrogen in the bay and very low phosphorus. Say, oh, we got a nitrogen problem. Well, no, because if you add more nitrogen, that's not going to generate more algae. If you add phosphorus, that's going to generate more algae. Okay. Furthermore, if you have the reverse, you have, say, a 16-to-2 ratio, now the algae are going to run out of nitrogen first. Biscayne Bay, the Everglades, and the east coast of Florida is phosphorus limited. But you go over the west coast of Florida, it is nitrogen limited. So you see an algal bloom, there's still lots of nitrogen around, but you won't see any phosphorus. So it turns out the nutrient or the factor that you need to be worried about the most is the one you can't measure because it's down at zero. You see the algae and you see the nitrogen, but you don't see the phosphorus. And again, a lot of people get confused about that. So what I'm going to focus on then is the source of these nutrients that lead to algal blooms. And then some of these produce toxins which can affect human health. So I've studied Biscayne Bay, the Florida Keys, all on the west coast where you get what's called the Florida red tide. Of course, inland, Lake Okeechobee, Caloosahatchee River, St. Lucie River, and Indian River Lagoon. My color scheme is going to be blue is low abundance of algae, and red is high abundance of algae. Okay, so here's just an example. We've got a big bloom in central part of Florida Bay here, okay? Here's Key Biscayne up here, here's South Biscayne Bay. And the point of this here is you folks are lucky. You actually live in one of the in terms of algal blooms, you live in one of the cleanest parts of Florida. They've got much bigger problems on the west coast, okay? For two reasons. See the blue, all of South Biscayne is actually remarkably clean compared to most everywhere else in Florida, okay? On top of that, being on Key Biscayne, anything that develops here gets flushed out pretty quickly by the tidal currents. You're right next to low nutrient ocean water. You've got over 2.5 million people living right next to Biscayne Bay. Think about all the septic tanks we still have in Miami, lawn fertilizer, golf courses, all that. So you would normally expect, as you see most everywhere else in the world, you would expect to see more algal blooms than what we actually see. So why is that? South Florida is really limestone mountain in the middle of the ocean. And calcium carbonate limestone is well known. It chemically interacts with phosphorus. It sucks up the phosphorus. So if you start out with a 16:1 ratio, it's going to suck out the phosphorus, and you end up with a 16:0 ratio. So in the 1980s, a large bloom of algae, cyanobacteria, developed in the north central part of Florida Bay. Here's Flamingo right here. Here's the Florida Keys down here. Something developed in the 1980s, and everybody was wondering why. Because again, there's no large population nearby. You're in the middle of Everglades National Park. Very few people there. There's no agriculture there or anything. So where did the nutrients come from? Key was the fact if you look at the distribution of nutrients. If it was sewage or a farm runoff or something like that, the nitrogen and phosphorus should be in the same place. But what you see is high phosphorus over here in the western part of Florida Bay. And you see this extending right on up the west coast. It goes right on up the west coast of Florida. And then the nitrogen is over in the eastern part of Florida Bay. They're in two different locations. That tells you it's not going to be sewage or farm runoff. It's going to be two different sources for these nutrients. And where the phosphorus from the west meets the nitrogen from the east, where they mix together in about a 16:1 ratio, that's where you get the bloom, right there in the middle of Florida Bay. Here's actually showing the chemical data, the ratio. So these blue dots over in the east says you got a higher than 16:1 ratio, which means it's a phosphorus-limited ecosystem. Over to the west, the red dots indicate you have a low NDP ratio, and it's going to be a nitrogen-limited ecosystem. And right there in the middle is where you get your large bloom. That's the chemical data, but it turns out the chemical data doesn't always tell you what nutrients are actually available to the algae. So I do what's called nutrient bioassays to actually ask the algae what are they limited by. And it turns out confirms the chemical data. And where they meet in the middle is where you get that bloom. Why do you have this high phosphorus? Remember, this is a limestone mountain. Why isn't the limestone sucking up all the phosphorus? Well, it turns out it deposited large amounts of phosphorus right there at the surface, just east of Tampa Bay. There's huge phosphate deposits in this area here, okay? And so starting about 100 years ago, people started mining that. 100 years ago, and just over time, the mines got larger and larger. Huge areas, essentially all of Polk County has been strip mine for this phosphorus, huge area. Because they've got over 1 billion tons of radioactive waste material from the mining activity. You can see this actually, satellite image. Oops. All this area, you see those sort of blue rectangles here, that's the remnants of those mines. Turns out to not be the source of the phosphorus in Florida Bay. Turns out, some unpublished data by a colleague of mine, Kevin Cunningham, and he showed that, in fact, those phosphate deposits right up at the surface up in Tampa Bay area continue on down underground. And so you see these large deposits in the western part of Florida Bay. They're about 50 feet below Florida Bay. You have something called geothermal circulation. The core of the earth is very hot. The limestone is very porous. So this is just the temperature profile. It's hot down here. And it heats up the water. Warm water rises. So it's like a pot of boiling water. It's just a lot slower. And so what's happening is you've got this geothermal circulation of groundwater coming up through those phosphate deposits, bringing it all the way up to the surface. We were able to confirm that, in fact, that's what's bringing the phosphorus up from those deposits up in Florida Bay, in the western part of Florida Bay. So those are actually natural processes generating the high phosphorus in western Florida Bay. But that's been there for millions of years. That doesn't explain why these blooms suddenly appeared in the 1980s. So let's look at the other half of the story. Where is that nitrogen coming from in the eastern Florida Bay? Well, that matches up pretty well with fresh water input. Notice blue is high salinity water, and the yellow is fresh water coming into the bay in the eastern part. That's coming from the Everglades down through Taylor Slough. So what we're going to do now is go upstream, see where that nitrogen is coming from. Here's Lake Okeechobee. Here's the northern third of the Everglades, which is now agricultural area. It's been drained for agriculture, primarily. It's like 90% sugarcane. Comes through the water conservation areas, and then down through Everglades National Park, down into Taylor Slope. We start up here in the sugarcane fields, go down through here, down into Florida Bay. Here's a transect. Here is the sugarcane fields over here. Here's Florida Bay down here. So here's phosphorus. So yes, there's phosphorus fertilizer being deposited in the sugarcane fields that is running downstream into the Everglades, and that was the basis of the federal lawsuit, okay, that led to the whole Everglades restoration plan and so on, which is now about a $20 billion plan. But you'll notice the combination of the plants and the limestone sucks up all the phosphorus well before it makes it to Florida Bay. So it's a problem in the Everglades. It is polluting the Everglades, but it's not a problem in Florida Bay because remember, the eastern part of Florida Bay was really low in phosphorus. The phosphorus and the nitrogen were in that 16-to-1 ratio. Those two nutrients, those two lines would be on top of each other. In fact, you've got huge amounts of nitrogen. Instead of a 16-to-1 ratio, it's like 100-to-1. Why would a farmer add huge excess amount of nitrogen? I mean, it costs a lot of money for nitrogen fertilizer. Why would you add excess knowing a lot of it's going to just run off and never go into your crop? Well, it turns out that's not fertilizer. It turns out that's a natural source, just like the phosphorus woods down in western Florida Bay. Well, where is that nitrogen coming from? Well, that's also then why the farmers like it, because they don't have to add any expensive nitrogen fertilizer. It's already in the soil for them. You think of Florida as being really flat, but it's not completely flat. We've got something called the Atlantic Coastal Ridge right along the coastline here, just south of Rickenbacker Causeway along Bayshore Drive. You see those limestone cliffs there. Okay. You also have the Lake Wales Ridge in the center of the state. And so that generates our watershed because there's a trough between these two ridges. So instead of the water going to the west and east running off the peninsula, it's channeled from Orlando south through the Kissimmee River Basin, Lake Okeechobee, and then down through the Everglades. Okay. So if you look at it from the side, you've got a ridge here, you've got a trough in the middle. During the last ice age, 18,000 years ago, Florida was like a desert, okay, very dry. But starting about 5,000 years ago, as we're coming out of the last ice age, as it gets more humid, moisture, now this trough starts filling up with water. And that's the beginning of the Everglades, okay? You're beginning to form wetlands. And what happens with wetlands is because the water goes anaerobic and it preserves all the organic matter. And this is how you generate peat. So what you built over 5,000 years, you built up about 15 feet or so of organic peat. It's almost pure organic material, and it's very rich in nitrogen. Okay? So wetlands, as a general rule, they suck up nutrients. They're a sink for nutrients, and that's why you have this really clean water coming out of the Everglades. Okay? What happens then, people come along and they want to drain the Everglades. And again, the northern third of the Everglades was drained for agriculture. When you drain it, you expose all that organic peat to the air, and now bacteria break down the organic peat and releases that nitrogen. So what's happened is 5,000 years worth of nitrogen has been released in the last 50 to 100 years. That is the source of the nitrogen. It's a natural source, but it's human activities that has drained the Everglades that's causing all this to be released now. People would be amazed how much uranium is naturally occurring in seawater. So when you precipitate the phosphorus from the seawater, you precipitate uranium as well.
Oh, so that's the waste.
And so then when they take the phosphate out and so on, you've enriched the waste material with uranium. And it's just reactive enough that EPA won't let them do anything with it. So it just piles up. They've got 1 billion tons of it now.
Wow.
1924, that was the surface of the land in this location in the Everglades. And you've lost all that soil. It was organic peat that just basically went up in the air, and then all the nitrogen flowed downstream. Here's another example. This home was built in the Everglades in 1930. The surface of the soil was there in 1930. And all that soil has subsided. It's basically disappeared, okay, releasing all the nitrogen. Okay, all the peat just turns into CO2 going into the air. So every few years, they have to add another step to the stairs here so they can get up to their front door. So that's the source of the nitrogen. So let's look at the history of agriculture in the northern third of the Everglades. This is sugarcane, okay? It starts out sort of puttering along first half of the 20th century. 1959, all of a sudden it shoots up. Why is that? Well, that's the Cuban Revolution. It's the middle of the Cold War. The U.S. government's not happy, having a communist dictator only 100 miles to the south. So they proceed for different ways of trying to get rid of Fidel Castro. Proceeded to try to destroy the Cuban economy, which at that time was primarily sugarcane. So there's a complex series of price supports, levies, huge increase of sugarcane farming in the Everglades. Okay. In fact, some of the major sugarcane growers that operated in Cuba, they just moved to South Florida. And today, they continue these subsidies. It's estimated it costs Americans about $5 billion a year to subsidize sugar. Sugar in this country costs a lot more than it does elsewhere. Okay. But that's notice that's the 60s, but we don't see the algal blooms in Florida Bay until the 80s. So why is that? Well, because, remember, think of the Everglades agricultural area, that was all Everglades. That was normally underwater as a wetlands. It's just like the Netherlands. You've got to pump all that water out. So what the Army Corps of Engineers did is they reversed the flow of water in South Florida. They installed these large pumps, and they pump all the agricultural runoff back upstream into Lake Okeechobee. And then downstream, the Caloosahatchee River to the west and St. Lucie to the east, okay? Well, not surprisingly, right, after a few decades of that, Lake Okeechobee used to be crystal clear water, but then you start getting algal blooms, fish kills, and then eventually lawsuits. So around 1980, the Army Corps says, well, I guess we can't do this anymore with all these lawsuits, so let's reverse the flow of water again. Maybe no one will notice. So now they decide to pump the water south. And of course, you can't flood Fort Lauderdale, Miami over here. So what they do is they enlarge the canal system over here down into Florida Bay. I'm going to show you data at this point about halfway between the sugarcane fields and South Florida. Okay, so here's the 60s and 70s. Very little water flowing south. It's all going back upstream into Lake Okeechobee. Now you have some hurricanes and stuff, but for the most part, very little until the 1980s when they reversed the flow again, and now you see all this water heading south. So here's the actual data for water going into the bay. So basically it's in the 80s that you see this large increase in this nitrogen-rich water going into Florida Bay. That's exactly when you see the algal blooms develop. Now there's a drought in 1989-90, but then they increased the flow even more. Now we don't have a whole lot of data back then, okay? But Karen DeMaria, she interviewed a bunch of fishermen. What did they say? And they all said from 1981, the water started getting cloudy. Started to have a hard time seeing the bottom. 1981, the water got dirtier, blooms grew, and seagrasses started dying. So you had the algal blooms that killed all the seagrasses, the whole ecosystem collapsed pretty much. It's another component that led to the Everglades restoration plan, with the decline of the Florida Bay ecosystem. Let's just illustrate this. This is during that drought of 89-90. Blue is high salinity. Here we're just looking at the salinity, saltiness of the water. Blue is high salinity, red or orange is low salinity. So there's very little fresh water coming in during the drought. Now we come out of the drought and you see get rid of the high salinity and you have all this fresh water coming into the bay. Now let's look at the nitrogen that's in that water. During the drought, there's very little nitrogen coming into the bay. But you come out of the drought, you dump a lot more fresh water in the bay, you dump a lot of nitrogen in the bay. And of course, again, when that nitrogen in the east mixes with the naturally occurring phosphorus in the west, that's where you get that large bloom right there in the middle. I'm going to take data at these stations here, right there where the bloom is. We have a highly seasonal cycle, a wet season and dry season. So you see that seasonal cycle here. And then the green is the size of the algal blooms. You see that seasonal cycle. If we just take monthly averages, here's your dry season. The blue is the water flow into the bay. You see the dry season, the wet season. And then the green is the size of the algal blooms. In addition to your seasonal cycle, we also have longer term shifts in the weather. We have El Nino years, things like that. So we have wet years and dry years. But you see the same thing. Here's some wet years and here's some dry years. So it seems to be a pretty good correlation between when you have all this nitrogen-rich water flowing into the bay and when you get the algal blooms. This didn't jive with government policy. And so the government was very unhappy with these data. So they hired some people to come up with a report to say, no, there's no correlation whatsoever. That all this nitrogen coming from the sugarcane farms has nothing to do with those algal blooms way down there in Florida Bay. Okay? Interesting enough, both of us use the same data set. I conclude there is a good correlation, and these other folks hired by the government said there's no correlation at all. How can this be? Well, it's because neither of us used the full data set. Okay? In other words, I took the data just at those locations there where the algal bloom is. He carefully took the data, he cherry-picked the data to take only the stations where there was no algal bloom, because you don't have any phosphorus over there in the east. So of course they didn't see a correlation. So the point is, you got to really be careful. You know, you see people saying all kinds of things. You got to really look carefully. Some people blatantly lie, but other times they don't really lie, but they play games. You have to look at the fine print, how they treated the data. They published a paper on this, and you have to look in the fine print. You have to know the details of the research to understand how they got those conclusions. But the average person would not. First of all, they would know those details, and they would know.
Confront the government?
Excuse me?
Did you confront?
Oh yes, I've testified about this before the head of the Army Corps of Engineers, before the head of the South Florida Water Management, because they've committed about $20 billion of taxpayers' money to this Everglades restoration plan, and it's based upon flawed analysis like this. The government's response is they want to pump more water into Florida Bay, claiming it's going to get rid of the blooms. The data show exactly the opposite. And another group of people funded by the government, they said in a paper, they said, Florida Bay blooms maximum in the summer and fall. That's fine. That's our rainy season. But then they go on and say, the blooms tend to be in the dry season. Wait a second, summer and fall is not a dry season. And it says, we don't get blooms during the wet season of April through June. April and May is the height of our dry season. Now, yeah, beginning in June, you start to get your wet season. Right. But even then, there's not much runoff yet in June because the soil's so dry. They reverse wet season to dry season. These people live in Florida. One of them works for the South Florida Water Management District. How could they not know when the wet season, dry season? That's just a blatant lie. Okay? And another person on this paper, she now is the head of the Red Tide program for the state of Florida. Now let's talk about another bloom. This is the so-called red tide over on the west coast of Florida. Okay, this is the species here called Carinia brevis. And it's notorious because it produces this neurotoxin here called brevetox, a very complex molecule, affects nerves in various ways. And it leads to large fish kills. Here's a harbor filled with dead, rotting fish. Kills manatees, dolphins, sea turtles, and so on. Okay? So for humans, it was initially called the neurotoxic shellfish poisoning because shellfish, like oysters and clams, they will filter the algae. They like eating the algae. And it turns out that toxin does not affect invertebrate animals like it does vertebrates. And so they happily eat the algae, but they can't get rid of the toxin. It accumulates in their tissues. A human comes along and eats the oyster or clam, and they get very sick. Good job of monitoring for red tide, and as soon as you have the presence of red tide, they shut down shell fisheries and warn people, don't harvest shellfish, things like that. Okay? But interesting enough, if you look at the hospital records over on the west coast where you get the red tide, during the red tide, you'll see about a 40% increase of people going to the hospital for gastrointestinal disorders. And I'll come back a little bit in a minute or two to why I think that is. Okay? The main effect that it has on people today is the toxin ends up in the air as an aerosol, and it's just like a nerve gas or tear gas. It irritates your eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. And again, if you look at the hospital records during times of red tide over on the west coast, there's about a 50% increase of people going to the hospital for various types of respiratory distress. So here I've mapped up 50 years worth of data on the red tide. This is the hot spot in the world for this particular species. It's basically along the coastline from Tampa Bay down to about Naples or Sanibel Island, okay? And again, mostly inshore, not offshore. So basically, it grows on the west coast of Florida. It does not grow very well on the east coast. The physics and the chemistry is very different. Now, you will occasionally get, I think last time you got here in Key Biscayne around 2018, you got a little bit of red tide, but it doesn't grow here. What happened was you have something called a loop current. It comes in from the Caribbean, from equatorial current coming through the Caribbean, straight to Yucatan, and it loops around the Gulf of Mexico and then comes up the east coast here. So what happened in 2018, it sort of wobbled inshore, picked up some of the red tide here, and carried it around, and came inshore, and brought it a little bit into Key Biscayne, Biscayne Bay, and further on up, Palm Beach and so on. But it's a temporary thing. So about once every 10 years, you'll get a little bit of the red tide picked up from the west coast, carried around to the east coast. You'll get a little bit, but it's not something you have to really worry about. So here I've done a transect on the west coast. Here's the shoreline over here. Here's offshore. So blue is salinity. So as you go inshore, salinity goes down. Notice that's your freshwater runout inshore. And then the red is the overall abundance of red tide. And again, obviously a lot more red tide inshore than it is offshore. But that right there tells you there might be a correlation between the nutrients in land runoff and abundance of red tide. Same thing, except now the blue line is the transect of data from 60 years ago. The red is a transect done more recently. In other words, on average, there's 15 times more red tide now than there was, say, 50, 60 years ago. There's been a large increase. If you just look at how dense the blooms, look at the very densest blooms you get. The densest blooms you got 60 years ago was like 2.5 times a million cells per liter, and now you get more like 35 million cells per liter. A lot more red tide. To get more red tide biomass, you've got to have more nutrients. I can't think of any natural sources of nutrients which would have increased 15-fold over the last 50 years or so. The one thing that obviously has increased in South Florida over the last 50, 60 years is us. A lot more people in South Florida than there was, particularly over in the southwest coast, like Naples and so on. Well, once again, I'm suggesting a linkage between human activities and red tide. So again, the government's not happy, so once again, they hire some people to say, no, it's all natural. Now, red tide does naturally occur. We have good evidence. It's been around for at least 500 years in low abundance. Okay? You naturally do get these blooms on occasion. Okay? But I've argued it's much worse now. You talk to people who lived there for many decades, they'll tell you it's much worse than it used to be. But the government says, no, there's not been an increase. Okay? And again, we're using the same data set. I took the raw data, did the statistics on it. What these other people did is they categorized the data. Anything less than 1,000 cells per liter, it says category 1. And there's 4 categories. And they took the statistics on just those 4 categories, not on the raw data. So anything over 100,000 cells per liter is called category 4. Told to do this by state scientists. The state told them how to manipulate the data. Okay, anything over 100,000 cells per liter is category 4. In other words, we went from category 4 to category 4. There's no increase in red tide. So again, depending on how you manipulate the data, you get different kind of results. You have to always be careful of this. Here is data on concentration frequency spectrum. Okay, this is the number of times samples were taken and there's no red tide found. So the blue line is what it was like 60 years ago, and the red line is what it is today. So back then, 70% of the time you'd find no red tide. Now it's less, only 40% of the time you'd find no red tide. Up to about 1,000 cells per liter, that's called natural background levels of the organism. It naturally lives in the Gulf of Mexico. Back then it was 15%, now it's more like 6 or 7%. Okay, so these low levels are less frequent than they used to be. And the high levels, let's go over here. Anything over about 100,000 cells per liter, that's when you start noticing it. At that point, you can see discoloration in the water. That's when you start getting fish kills, and you start feeling the effects in the air, okay? Respiratory effects and so on. And that's what everyone focuses on, these high concentrations. These are the big blooms that everyone sees. You can see all the dead fish. But you'll notice even these concentrations here are more abundant than they used to be. These are what we call sublethal concentrations. It's not enough to kill the fish or anything. And people tend to ignore that, okay? But what happens is these sublethal concentrations, it's still there, and it's still getting in the fish. It's just not enough to kill the fish, okay? So what happens, there's some data from a colleague. I know you can't see the numbers or anything, but here a colleague of mine looked at like 30 or 40 different species of fish in a place that had not had red tide for a long time, and yet you see brevetoxin in them. Now, it's not enough to kill the fish, but it's in there, okay? And what we're seeing now in the Gulf of Mexico is we're seeing dolphins die. There's no red tide around, okay? As you do the autopsy, they're packed full of brevetoxin. Okay, they're dying from it. What they're doing, they're eating all these live fish, and over time, they're accumulating more and more brevetoxin. Okay, until eventually they die. It's just like methylmercury, you just accumulate more and more. A lot of people go to the hospital for gastrointestinal disorders during red tide. I think they're eating live fish. Fishermen know not to eat the dead fish, but they see live fish, they say it must be okay. But there's sublethal concentrations in those fish. You see in the second half of the 20th century, this dramatic increase in nutrients. Okay, this helps explain what we're seeing with this increase in red tide. Same thing with remnants of algae in the sediments. Same thing if you look at groundwater in Central Florida, this is nitrogen concentrations. That's why all those crystal clear springs up in Central Florida used to be tourist attractions. They're turning green now with algae. Turns out this is the major source of nutrients feeding the red tide. Blue is the original watershed of the Clusaz River. It's not connected to Lake Okeechobee at all. But when they wanted to back pump the water out of the sugarcane fields in the lake, they made a connection so they could dump it down the Clusaz River. Same time, they also drained the Kissimmee River Basin. So the watershed of the Clusaz River now is 4 times what it used to be. And it was converted from wetlands that normally suck up nutrients. It's been converted into agricultural land which release nutrients. And so you see this huge increase. I'm going to show you one quick sequence. This just shows flow down the Clusaz River. This is your dry season, this is your rainy season, okay? And I'm just going to go month by month. Black dots indicate sample was taken, there's no red tide. Larger red dot, the higher the abundance of red tide. I'm just going to go month by month. We're starting in the dry season, February, no red tide. June is beginning the wet season, you start to see a little bit of red tide at the mouth of the Clusaz River there. And then over time, it gets larger and larger. And then eventually dwindles away. Go back to blooms of cyanobacteria. We get blooms certain times in Biscayne Bay. I showed you one in Florida Bay, Lake Okeechobee, Clusaz River, and so on. And these have health effects. I'll just print out wide variety of toxins produced by these. I was going to talk about 2 of these, microcystins and BMAA. So, okay, microcystins actually discovered over about 100 years ago. A bunch of sheep died in Australia. Okay, whole herd of sheep in one location all die about the same time. So they look into it, and basically they find all these sheep were drinking from a certain pond over here, and that pond has an algal bloom in it. So scientists take these algae, study, and that's how they discovered microcystin. And we now know that this toxin is responsible for lots of animal deaths around the world, human deaths, and also gastrointestinal disorders and so on. But then as people then start studying the biochemistry, how this microcystin kills people and so on, you discover, look at the biochemical pathways and so on, you discover it can also cause long-term liver damage. It's a tumor promoter. It can lead to liver cancer and colorectal cancer. All the algal toxins we know about have been discovered. A bunch of people get sick or die about the same time, location. What do they have in common? Well, they all ate at a certain restaurant last night, and they all eat the clams. So you track it back where those clams get harvested from. You go look in that estuary where the clams came from, there's an algal bloom. And so you discover new species of algae that's been blooming, and you find out the toxins. So almost all the toxins we know about have been discovered that way. My concern is, what happens if you've got a toxin that only causes cancer? Well, cancer takes 10 or 20 years to develop usually. So people eat a certain meal, but then they die of cancer 10 or 20 years later. Well, how are you going to track it back? Because people moving around, they're all going to die at different times. You're never going to be able to track it back to a certain meal they ate 10 or 20 years earlier. Okay? So that's my concern. Are there toxins out there that have no short-term effects but only have long-term effects? And we've recently discovered one. Just think of the different kind of effects that an algal toxin could have. Compounds produced by algae just smell bad or taste bad if it's used in the drinking water. Skin irritation if you're swimming in the water. And then gastrointestinal disorders. Those I call the good toxins because you get the effects fairly quickly within minutes or hours or just a day or so. And you know you've been exposed to something and you can do something about it. But you can also have long-term neurological damage, liver damage, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS, or cancer. So my concern is what happens if you've got a toxin that can have long-term effects and has no short-term effects. You have no idea you're being exposed to that toxin. This is the compound, I'm pretty sure, has that effect, BMAA. And now there's good evidence it leads to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS. These are called the tangle disease because the characteristic of them is you end up accumulating more and more protein tangles in your brain cells until your brain cells die. So it accumulates over time. It takes decades for these neurological diseases to develop. And we know that they're primarily environmental. They're only like 5% genetic. I mean, there are certain genes that can make you more susceptible to it and so on, but they're primarily got to be environment. For many decades, been research trying to figure out what actually leads to these diseases. Now, the exception is Huntington's disease. That is 100% genetic. We know the gene involved in Huntington's disease. So it just shows the kind of protein tangles that you get in your brain cells from these different diseases. Well, the way this got discovered is unusual. After World War II, during World War II, when the Japanese and Americans are fighting over the islands in the Western Pacific, including the island of Guam, the native Chamorro people of Guam, after about 10, 15 years after the war, all of a sudden you see this huge increase in neurodegenerative disease, like 150-fold higher than normal. A large fraction of the population died from these different neurodegenerative diseases. And then later it dropped off back down to natural levels. So there's a lot of research done into this, and people couldn't figure out what was going on. Then more recently, a colleague of mine took a totally different approach. He's an ethnobotanist. Took a totally different approach. He actually went and lived with people, learned their language and everything. And what he learned is they liked eating the fruit bats on the island of Guam. I might point out, in addition to the native Chamorro people, you also had Americans and Asians living on the island. They did not have any effects, just the native Chamorro people. Well, what happened was, it's not easy to catch a fruit bat, so they only ate a few bats. But during World War II, because of the war, they had very little other food, so they were half starving to begin with because of the war. But for the first time, they had access to guns. So now they started shooting all the fruit bats, for food. And in fact, they drove the fruit bat population to extinction. But they gorged themselves on the bats, and then 10 or 20 years later, you see this huge increase in these neurodegenerative diseases. And then after they can't eat any more bats again, because they've driven them to extinction, then 10 or 20 years after that, then incidence of disease goes back down again. So what's going on? Well, it turns out what you had were cyanobacteria. These produce BMAA. All cyanobacteria produces BMAA, and it lives superficially on the roots of the cycad trees there, and it biomagnifies. This compound biomagnifies up the food chain, from the cyanobacteria to the cycad trees to their seeds, and then the fruit bats, also called flying foxes, but they're bats. Concentrate, and you end up with really high concentrations of BMA in these fruit bats. Remember that number, 3,500. Come back to that. Here are data. These are the brain tissues of the Chamorro people who died of these neurodegenerative diseases. You see high levels of BMA in their brains. Here's your controls. Here's Canadians who've died of heart disease or cancer or something. No BMAA in their brains. So that all makes sense. But then here's two Canadians who also died of Alzheimer's. You look over here, they have BMA in their brains. When I saw those, I go, well, wait a second, these Canadians presumably were not eating extinct fruit bats from Guam. There's other pathways for getting BMA into your brain. This is of concern. A colleague of mine at the University of Miami Medical School, she runs the brain bank. So she's always American brains to work with. People who have died of ALS or Alzheimer's, presumably not eating fruit bats from Guam. Sure enough, they've got high levels of BMA in their brains. Having the neurodegenerative disease could cause your brain to accumulate BMA. Okay, well that's where Alzheimer's comes in. Remember, it's genetic. So here's Americans who died of Huntington's disease, no BMA in their brains. That tells you it's the BMA that's leading to the neurodegenerative disease, not the opposite. I've been studying these blooms of cyanobacteria throughout South Florida. We've got lots of these blooms. Is this a risk right here in South Florida? Other studies have also shown this connection. People have fed BMA to vervet monkeys, and you see these protein tangles start to develop in their brains. Epidemiological studies by a colleague of mine up in New England and other people over in France have done the same thing. And sure enough, people who live near lakes that have these blooms of cyanobacteria have a much greater chance, like a 20-fold greater chance of coming down with ALS. Okay. Also worked with a colleague of mine at the medical school. She's a neurologist. With fruit flies, the idea of this is that they have a short lifespan, so you can get lifetime results in 3 months with a fruit fly. The blue and black lines here, that's the natural lifespan of the fruit flies. We now expose them to the air above those algal blooms at Lake Okeechobee to again expose that BMA. You see all kind of neurological problems in these fruit flies, and they have a shortened lifespan. What's the mechanism? Well, BMA turns out it's an unusual amino acid. How do you form proteins? So you hook up a transfer RNA with, say, an amino acid, and that's what then causes you to transfer from the RNA sequence to the amino acid sequence of a protein. And you have to have that proper sequence of amino acids for that protein to form its proper three-dimensional structure so it functions properly. Well, it turns out the transfer RNA for serine, another amino acid, is very similar to BMA. Transfer RNA can get mixed up between BMA and serine. So if you have a high level of BMA in your diet, you start putting BMA instead of serine into your proteins. And that changes the three-dimensional structure. Normal protein is going to look like the slinky here. It's folded up properly. It's going to function. If you put in the BMA, it changes the folding of the protein, and it gets this tangled mess. That's the characteristic of these neurodegenerative diseases. All these tangled proteins accumulating in your brain cells. The brain can't get rid of them, and they accumulate until it kills the brain cells. So let's go back to that bloom in Florida Bay. That's cyanobacteria. There's BMA, and it's producing BMA. Here's 2 pink shrimp that are collected from it. Here's one concentration of BMA, 3,000. Remember, those fruit bats are like 3,500. You would not want to eat pink shrimp from Florida Bay. Summer of 2005, Florida Department of Transportation decided to expand the road here that goes from Homestead down to Key Largo. That's called so-called 18-mile stretch. To do that, they bulldozed all the mangroves on either side, chopped them up, and just dumped them in the water. I won't go into the reason why, but the chemistry is such that as that stuff decomposes, it causes the calcium carbonate limestone to release that phosphorus. Remember I said before, limestone sucks up phosphorus. Well, this released it again. So all of a sudden there's this huge increase in phosphorus in the water. Remember, phosphorus is a limiting nutrient. So this is before the bulldozing of the mangroves, this is afterwards. You got this huge increase in phosphorus and a huge increase in cyanobacterial algal blooms, which lasted for about 3 years until eventually it all flushed out. Now, unfortunately, I don't have an ideal sample because I got samples from a colleague of mine. He happened to have a bunch of frozen animals in his freezer he didn't need anymore. He collected them up here at the edge of the bloom. So it wasn't ideal, but it's all we had. But nevertheless, because animals do move around and stuff, you do see some individuals. Here's a blue crab, twice that of the fruit bats of Guam. It's a puffer fish, same thing, about 7,000. Clusatchie River, here's Lake Okeechobee here. High abundance of cyanobacteria along there. Here's just a picture of it behind one of those dams on the river. Okay, coming from the Lake Okeechobee. Look at the fish, ranging from like 500 to 2,500. So reasonably high levels of BMA in those fish. About 2/3 of the water from Lake Okeechobee go down the Clusatchie River to the west. About 1/3 goes down the St. Lucie Canal to the east into the southern part of the Indian River Lagoon. Okay, here's a picture of the blooms down there on St. Lucie. Okay, and what I wanted to do is look at the very top of the food chain, which is like the bottlenose dolphins, because they're eating the fish. Now they're an endangered species, so it took me like about a year to get a permit to get tissue samples. I was able to eventually get some brain tissue from the dolphins that had died in the Indian River Lagoon. The advantage is, because it's an endangered species, is every time they find a dead dolphin, they do a full autopsy to find out what killed it. So here's the data. This dolphin here, we didn't find any BMA in its brain. The autopsy showed it had been hit by a boat. Okay? The other 5, on the other hand, all had high levels of BMA in their brains. And the autopsies for those 5 dolphins could not find a cause of death. They had no idea what killed it. But you sort of wonder now. Okay? And I've actually talked to 2 researchers who study the behavior of dolphins in the River Lagoon. They've told me they've seen a number of dolphins that seem confused. They're sort of wandering around, sometimes wandering up freshwater rivers and so on. Okay, sounds just like an Alzheimer's patient, just sort of wandering around. So you got to wonder if the BMA is what led to their death, because those numbers are pretty high, similar to the people of Chamorro, of Guam. Finish up here. The pharmaceutical industries, we think about penicillin. It naturally comes from microbes. The pharmaceutical, a lot of our drugs come from natural products. Okay, so the pharmaceutical industry is always looking for new compounds that are useful as antibiotics, anti-cancer compounds, et cetera. So they go all around the world looking for new compounds from rainforests, coral reefs, and so on. And they study lots of cyanobacteria as well. Okay, and as a result of their research, we now know these cyanobacteria can produce over 1,000 different kinds of unusual compounds. Okay, with all kind of strange structures. So those have got to be bioactive. There's not just natural waste products. They're producing these far-away resources. In most cases, we just don't know what it is. And so if you're exposed to these algal blooms, you're getting exposed to those compounds. And we don't know what their effects may be. Okay, but let's go back to this list here. Okay, if it has these short-term effects, you learn about it pretty quickly. Those are the toxins we've learned about. My concern is about all these compounds. Do some of those compounds we're exposed to, could they have these long-term effects? And we just don't know, because it's very hard to discover those. We discovered BMA pretty much by accident because of that really unusual event in Guam. There's probably a lot of other toxins that have these long-term effects as well, and we just don't know. This is of great concern to us. Let me stop there, and I'll take questions.
Research to eliminate this protein from the body?
Some people have argued that if you're worried about this, to have a serine-rich diet, because it turns out it's the ratio of serine to BMA. So if you think you're going to get exposed to BMA, if you have a lot of serine in your diet, that's going to make for a better ratio and reduce the chances of the BMA getting incorporated into your protein. But once it's in your protein, though, you can't suck it back out. It's there, you're stuck with it.
Once you ingest it, there's no way you can really get it
Right.
back out of your system.
Yeah, but the Chamorro people, they were eating those fruit bats. They were happy with it, right?
Right.
Tasted fine. There was no short-term effects or anything. You could be eating a meal and not have any idea that you're being, eating a toxin, but then you come down with this disease 10, 20 years later. I personally would not eat any fish coming out of, say, the Everglades in our coastal waters where we're getting these blooms. Now, offshore fish, you don't get these blooms offshore because there's low nutrients once you get away from land. And so tuna and all your fish that live out in the middle of the ocean, they're fine.
So if you're looking at like groupers or other types of like reef fish that are closer to shore, that may have more of an issue depending on where they're.
So again, like the Florida Keys, 40 years ago that would have been fine, but now we're getting algal blooms in the Florida Keys as well, and so it's becoming more and more of a problem. Well, that's what's interesting. I'd be worried about it because if you look at more details, it's the benthic crustaceans that tended to have the highest concentrations, like crab. We didn't study lobsters specifically, but those crabs had high level BMA, so I suspect lobsters would be high as well.
Aquaculture salmon.
Yes, that's a big problem. For example, shrimp. Okay, a lot of shrimp that you buy now has actually been farmed. Salmon should be fine. Yeah, but I'm just going to mention shrimp. A lot of people do eat shrimp. A lot of the stuff, does come from farms. And you look at those ponds, because they're dumping so much food in those ponds with the high densities of shrimp, all that excess nutrients generate large blooms of cyanobacteria. And I asked one of the people who runs these farms, they told me, I asked them how much of the diet of the shrimp comes from the food you're adding versus from the algal blooms. They told me maybe 50-50. Half of the food is actually they're eating the algae itself. So I suspect I would not eat these shrimp.
What about sardines?
Sardines should be fine because they tend to be more offshore.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're low in the food chain. Yeah, yeah. I mean, what you really want to know is, where those fish came from? Do you get algal blooms? That's the question. Well, unfortunately, we're getting more and more blooms all around the world, though, as a result of this.
You also say that we are easier here in the East Coast than in the West Coast, no?
Most of Biscayne Bay is, well, South Biscayne Bay is very clean. Now, get up north, you do get more, you are getting some blooms up in North Biscayne Bay, some fish kills up there. But here, South Biscayne Bay, it's fine. But again, like if you catch a fish right here offshore, but fish move around, so it might be feeding inshore, because if you go near the canal mouths, right along the shoreline, you do get algal blooms there, and you do see a lot of cyanobacteria there. So you might catch the fish here. If it ate, you got its food right there along the canal mouth, it could have fairly high levels of BMA.
Practical terms, is there anything that we common citizens can do to counteract what you described as government corruption with these studies and these published papers that mean nothing?
Right.
Basically, there are no scientific base to them. So is there anything that we can do to, raise awareness about what the government is doing?
I myself, I mean, I've gone to a lot of meetings, I've testified, all this stuff, and politicians just ignored it, I've given a lot of public talks to various environmental groups, and a lot of these, environmental NGOs and stuff. They, they go to, to newspapers, and they do make it public information. You see this mostly on the West Coast. You don't see much here in Miami, but on the West Coast, there's a lot of people very active in these issues of the nutrients and algal blooms and stuff. But again, politicians are free to ignore it too. As long as people keep voting for these politicians, they ignore it.
What it comes down to is sort of understanding what the various people who are running for positions in government, what their stance is on these different things that you care about, and then voting accordingly is really like the best voice that you have is how you vote. Don't eat fish or anything that comes out of the water, because I'm a marine biologist and I've read stuff like this, but I'm not vegetarian. I refuse to read about chickens because I have to eat something.
Are they endangering their lives by taking fish, eating it or selling it forever?
People that come, to the park or wherever, and they're fishing like right here offshore and taking the fish with them, is that a problem? Are they, endangering themselves or whoever they give the fish to?
Possibly. I mean, if you caught it right here, but again, maybe the fish was here when you caught it, but it might have been over there inshore near an algal bloom yesterday or a few days ago. I mean, they swim around. So that's the problem. You don't really know where the fish are getting their food from, so they may or may not be getting it. Now, tuna out in the middle of the ocean, you don't have to worry about that. They get all their food from offshore. But if you're near here, I mean, again, these fish are roaming around, so you just don't know. I showed you some that had high numbers of pufferfish and a crab that had really high levels of BMA, but there are a bunch of others that were caught in the same area which are low, because all those animals are moving around, and that sample came from the edge of the bloom. So it depends on where they came from. So you're just taking a risk.
Well, you said earlier Biscayne Bay is generally fairly clean. The northern part of Biscayne Bay, closer to Miami Beach, has had a lot of algal bloom problems.
Yeah.
Just recently, there was a toadfish kill.
Right.
Thousands of toadfish were killed because of an algal bloom.
Right.
And that was, 2 months ago?
On average, like 10 times higher in North Bay than in South
So there's
Bay.
always a chance if you catch a fish down here that it might have been swimming around up north in the bay. You don't
Yeah.
know.
Your risk is much less if you eat a fish from here than if you eat a fish from North Biscayne Bay or from the West Coast. But it's not like zero.
In the areas that are very dangerous.
Politicians to put signs all over the place that said don't eat the fish. I'll give you a good example of this. When they first discovered, this is like about 20 years ago, when they first discovered there's huge amounts of methylmercury in the fish in the Everglades and so on, they just put a bunch of signs all over the place, along all the canals and Tamimi Trail, all of these places, don't eat the fish because of high methylmercury. Well, then the governor at the time was Jeb Bush. He thought that didn't look good for PR. And he ordered all those signs taken down. The methyl mercury didn't go away, only the signs did, warning people that you don't want to eat those fish.
Example of that, I'm from northern Indiana, and a lot of people go fishing in the St. Joe River, which is right along the northern border of Indiana, and it connects to Lake Michigan. And they actually stock that with salmon. And salmon, if most of you probably know, salmon will spawn in rivers and then they swim out and they live in the sea their whole life and then they come back upriver to spawn again. And so when you have salmon that are stocked in freshwater, in that case, they swim into Lake Michigan and they think it's the ocean. They grow up there and they don't really come back and spawn again. They just keep stocking them every year. Because of that area, the connection to Lake Michigan and everything, there's a high level of lead in a lot of these fish. And they warn people, you know, don't eat more than like 1 pound or 2 pounds of this type of fish every month because it's dangerous. You're accumulating lead. And I guarantee you there are tons of fishermen that eat way more than that. They don't, there's no signs or anything. They just kind of issue a warning, like publicly. So if you don't even hear the warning or you don't see it or wherever they issue it, then you won't even know. They don't try very hard because it's an industry that they don't want to disrupt because it brings in money.
All these blooms are near the shore where you're getting all this land runoff of these high nutrients. You want to swim in like the red tide because that toxin gets in the air. You're breathing that in as you're swimming. Some of these things are what we call dermatoxins. You go in the lake and all of a sudden your skin's on fire. If you see green water, you don't want to go swimming in it.
This type of BMAA in the cyanobacteria, that's usually a pretty obvious bloom because it's very green. Okeechobee, it almost looks like guacamole in some places. It's very obvious, and you wouldn't want to go swimming in it anyway, but generally better to stay out of it. Well, thank you all so much.